At the beginning of the film, the United States Army are preparing to bomb Hanoi on October 26, 1967, and John McCain is a member of that force. At that time, he and his comrades were preparing, and before heading to the plane, they were asked to remove all personal attributes such as wedding rings and name tags. Only after that, John along with 21 other soldiers, one by one, took off. At first, all went well, but then, they felt the missile rain as they approached Hanoi. Although previously, they had received an explanation of the missile truck under their plane, but the missile fire was still surprising, because there were so many. A missile managed to bring down one fighter plane after hitting its wing, while others were chased, including the plane that John was driven in. John and his comrades took all their defensive skills and dodged the attack, but unfortunately, the missile still hit the plane's tail, so they had to get out of the plane immediately. News of the crash of John's plane in Hanoi reached his father, who was an admiral. They reported that no one had seen John get out of his plane after being hit by a missile. However, the military will continue to investigate until John's condition is confirmed. John's father, Jack McCain, was of course very sad to hear the news. However, he tries to maintain his authority by submitting the entire process according to the applicable procedures. Not only were John's father and mother very sad, his wife felt the same way. She was very shocked when she heard the news that her husband had disappeared in enemy territory. But apparently, John managed to land safely. But he had drowned because he was caught by the rope parachute. Shortly thereafter, the peasants came to his aid, followed by several Vietnamese soldiers who immediately searched him. John was no longer able to fight back, let alone a Vietnamese soldier who deliberately injured John's leg with a bayonet. John was increasingly helpless when he was carried on a stretcher and his hands were tied very tightly. Not long after that, John arrived at the Vietnamese headquarters, and he was immediately put into a special cell for prisoners of war. There, he was simply laid down and left to endure the pain all night long. The next day, John was brought to the treatment room. In this room, two Vietnamese soldiers came and showed the news of the downing of a pilot in Hanoi. The headline mentions Admiral Jack McCain's son and a photo of John yesterday being carried on a stretcher. They asked John to name the squadron, but John of course refused the request. And the refusal forced John to endure the pain of being hit several times. After being hit twice, John remained silent. But when he was hit for the third time, John gave in and mentioned a few names. But actually, the names John mentioned were the names of his favorite baseball team, and it was heard by a soldier lying weakly beside John. But unfortunately, when John tried to get acquainted with the soldier, he was silent, as if he could no longer speak. Lying on the nursing bed made John think back to his old school days. His father had been called to school because of John's bad grades and attitude. The school then suggested that John apply to a regular university, rather than go on to the Naval Academy, which would likely not accept John. However, according to Jack, as long as his son doesn't break the code of honor, steal, or commit violence, then it's not a big deal. Before leaving, Jack asked firmly that the school no longer call him if only for trivial matters. In 1953, John finally graduated from school and was accepted into the Navy school, as expected. Although John is the son of an admiral, Jack strongly emphasizes that John is disciplined and obeys the applicable regulations. As a father, Jack trusted his son very much, even today, when John is declared to have fallen in Hanoi. He firmly believed John could survive, and his belief proved to be true. One day, John was asked to speak to a French journalist, and he was told to say he was grateful that he had been helped by the Vietnamese. In addition, he was also asked to regret his actions for attacking the country. Because he was threatened, then John did as ordered. But he never said he regretted his actions. When French journalists confirmed the squadron names that John had revealed to Vietnam, he repeated the names of members of his favorite baseball team. After that, he was allowed to deliver a message to his family.
To my wife, I will get well, and that I love her, and I hope to see her soon.
The tape of the interview finally reached John's family, and Jack was so proud to see his son survived, that even John was able to hide the names of his squadron. While John's wife was deeply moved and convinced that John could come back to her. A few days later, John was again put in a cell, and this time he was placed with two other prisoners. They were no better off than John. A prisoner named Norris had a mental breakdown, and he often had hallucinations. While the other was called Bud, who had a limp leg and couldn't stand for long. In the days that followed, John and his two new friends were always together. Norris also said that Bud not only hurt his leg, but also broke his arm. He once fell in the border area and managed to return, but the Vietnamese soldiers caught him and dragged him and hung him for several days. As a new prisoner, John was often treated worse than his cellmates, such as being told to clean his friend's poop and receiving very hard beatings in several parts of his body. The pain John was feeling right now exceeded all the punishments he had endured at the Naval Academy. In the past, he was often reprimanded for his lack of discipline and poor academic grades, even though John was the son of the admiral, who was supposed to be a good model. A soldier named Whit, who was in charge, often gave John harsh punishments and sometimes called him unfit for the academy. But even so, John insisted that he would prove that he could survive without his father's name. Time goes on, and it doesn't feel like it's been 3 years that John has been in the camp. Right in February, a high-ranking Vietnamese, Cat, came to summon Norris for questioning. Meanwhile, Bud asks John to remember the names of the Americans who have died in camp, so that if one of them survives, the names can be reported. Not long after, Norris was returned to his cell and explained that he had been offered amnesty. Hearing that, Bud immediately suspected, because to get the amnesty prize, Norrie must have leaked something very important. However, Norris denied the accusations and admitted that he did not say anything. Unfortunately, situations prove it all, because that night, Cat comes and proclaims Norris' freedom. Thus, Bud and John firmly believed that Norrie had leaked some very important information. But in the end, the two of them chose to surrender, because no one would be able to endure the torment that had been received so far, so whoever it was would surely do the same for the sake of freedom. A few days later, the guard came and ordered Bud to pack up. John was of course shocked and asked where Bud was going. The guard didn't say anything, while Bud thought he was just transferred to another cell. Before leaving, the two encourage each other and hope they can meet again someday. After Bud left, John really had to survive on his own. He spent a lot of time contemplating and memorizing the names of the soldiers who had died. Apart from that, he also tried to keep his body in shape by exercising a little, although in fact, it was very difficult because there were too many wounds all over his body. For 18 months, John lived in a cell alone, never having knowledge or speaking to other prisoners. One day, as usual, he went to throw his dirt himself, and at the same time, Cat was seen coming out of a room. Curious and feeling an opportunity, John approached the room and was immediately startled when he saw Bud hanging limply and helplessly. During this time, it turns out that Bud was never transferred to another cell, but he was tortured and hanged like an animal. John did nothing and came back regretting that he couldn't help Bud. In the midst of his sadness, suddenly heard a voice calling from the next room. He immediately used a cup to clarify the sound, and it came from a prisoner who had just been transferred. The prisoner's name was Bob Craner, from the Air Force, and he had heard of John, who was known as a bad boy at the academy. Bob then said that he was arrested in December 1967, which means 3 months after John was arrested. Unfortunately, their conversation had to stop because Bob heard the guards approaching his room. Meanwhile, on the other hand, John's wife, Carol, is trying to deliver letters to John. In the letter, Carol tells of their children growing up well, and they consider their father a hero. Unfortunately, the letter never arrived, because Cat read it first and held it back. After getting acquainted with Bob, John and Bob turned out to have the same fun. They both love baseball, and they often talk about it in their spare time. Bob told John that he had met a beautiful woman who also liked baseball. They even had a date and talked about baseball with fun. Bob's story made John think back to when he was with his friends. When they were seniors, they went to the bar with a junior. John is also very good at exaggerating his experience, to the point of making the junior jealous. But the junior is not jealous of John's experience, but how John managed to hold beautiful women. The delusion was only a momentary pleasure for John, for his body was still trapped in the holding cell. When he was allowed to go out, he saw 2 prisoners who seemed to be relaxing and enjoying the music. When John approached, they immediately called the other Vietnamese soldiers to pick up John. Because of that, John was then forced to be taken to the sewerage room and drowned. When he entered the cell, John told Bob what he had seen, and according to Bob, they were traitors who sold information to the Vietnamese for different treatment. Bob also heard news about prisoners receiving amnesty. According to him, not all of them were free, but some ended up being tortured to death, unless they wanted to redeem the amnesty with very valuable information. A few weeks later, John was called into Cat's room and was greeted with a generous serving of fruit. Cat reported that a few days ago, John's father got a promotion and he must be very happy because soon, John will get amnesty and can be reunited with his family. Hearing this, John was not surprised. But he wasn't too happy, because he knew Vietnam couldn't possibly release a prisoner unless the man provided very important information. At that time, John only said that he would think about it first, because in his heart, he did not want that he would have to betray, or in the end, he would be tortured to death. When he returned to the cell, John again told Bob the reason why he was summoned, and Bob immediately asked what the Vietnamese wanted in return. John replied that he did not know, because the Vietnamese did not ask for anything. Bob then advised John to accept the amnesty and see what to do next. After that conversation, John never heard Bob's voice again. John had to go back to feeling lonely and spending time alone. Until finally, a few weeks later, Kat called him to inquire about John's decision. Because John still doesn't answer, Kat gives him the letters from Carol that he's been keeping. The letters made him even more in a dilemma, especially when he learned the news of his son growing up and often asked when John would come home. Even so, John's determination and belief to be loyal to his country is still great. When he was called again, John balked when asked to thank Vietnam for taking care of him. Not only that, he was also asked to confess to bombing schools and Vietnamese citizens. If only John wanted to say that, Kat promised to release him, but all John did was keep quiet as usual. Instead, he asked for sweets that his child sent through one of the letters. For remaining stubborn, John finally got tortured, and this time more painful than the torture he had ever received so far. His hands were tied behind his back very tightly, and after that he was hanged for several days. As a result of the torture, one of John's hands could no longer be moved, even to take a glass of drinking water. The torment he experienced did not end there, because the next day the prison guard came, and this time John was beaten to a pulp by his hand, which was already helpless. He was forced to stand and kicked and even threatened with shooting if John did not try to stand. The next day, John was again forced to confess his guilt for bombing Vietnam. John again refused and he was again hanged. That second sentence really tortured John more than ever. His morals and desire to be free to argue with each other in his heart, he recalled how his treacherous friends got freedom and different treatment. But on the other hand, John remembers his father's message, that the McCains are a family of principles that never betray. Time goes on, until there is a bright spot regarding peace between Vietnam and America. All that happened because there were many large-scale demonstrations asking for the war to be stopped immediately. Therefore, there was an initial agreement that both sides must treat prisoners of war humanely. For the first time, all prisoners were removed from their respective cells, and John used the moment to meet Bob. There, Bob knew John could have left a long time ago, but he also knew how loyal John was to his country. On March 15, 1973, a peace agreement was finally reached and the United States recognized Vietnam's sovereignty as an independent nation. The peace treaty was read aloud in front of all the prisoners of war, then one by one the names and dates of arrests were read out so they could get into the car, driving them to freedom. When John's name was mentioned, he could look proudly at the Vietnamese soldiers who had failed to make him surrender. John's return with the other prisoners was greeted with great cheer in America. Carol and her children welcomed John happily. Shortly thereafter, Jack also joined there and greeted John proudly. After that, they went back to their respective homes, and on one occasion, John and his father spoke. John talked a lot about his dark times in the Vietnamese detention camp. And for the first time, the father stated that he was proud that John was able to survive almost 2,000 days in a camp filled with the torments of life. It is a battle between fear and courage, when fear wins means defeat, and when courage wins means struggles to become stronger.